Today's topic is not a groundbreaking theory or a brand new lore revelation, but more so a demonstration of just how flexible Zelda lore can be sometimes. With every new entry into the series, it often brings with it new concepts and information which can sometimes change or even nullify previously held beliefs within the Zelda community. A popular example would be the origin of the Master Sword. For many years it was believed that the ancient sages had a big hand in the creation of the Sword of Evil's Bane, all because of a quote from Twilight Princess. However, Skyward Sword would go on to tell a different version of events several years later, showing that it was in fact the Hero of the Sky in collaboration with Fi and the goddess Hylia that created the iconic sword. And there are many more examples like this, where certain details change or are expanded upon as new games make their debut into the franchise. While this can sometimes be a bit frustrating for those who like the theory craft about Zelda lore, it is to an extent part of the very nature of The Legend of Zelda. As the title elegantly suggests, Link's adventures and in particular the backstories that come with it are by design a collection of ancient legends, stories and folklore, which often take place hundreds or even thousands of years apart. And just like real life myths and legends, some of them might be true or partially true, while others are pure fiction or at the very least a heavily sensationalized version of events. Kinda like those horror movies that say based on a true story. Mythology and legendary tales are at the very core of the Zelda series. I mean, the very idea of a sword being pulled from a pedestal by a hero who's worthy has clearly been inspired by stories like King Arthur and Excalibur, which in and of itself is a legend whose validity is still up for discussion. As Zelda fans, we kinda have to accept the reality that just because something is said to have happened or is likely to be true does not mean that it is, even if there is evidence to support it. It's always possible that the huge passages of time have caused certain knowledge to become warped or misconstrued. Which brings us to the Minish Cap, the last entry in a series of 3 Zelda games made by Capcom as opposed to Nintendo's in-house development team, the other 2 of course being Oracle of Ages and Seasons. These games are in a unique position in that they are fully accepted as canon to the franchise both by fans and Nintendo alike, despite being developed by a third party, not counting remakes and remasters of course. The vast majority of third-party material is treated as either non-canon, ambiguously canon, or it's still unclear because Nintendo hasn't made an official statement about it, like with Age of Calamity for example. But not so with the Oracles and the Minish Cap. They are legitimate entries that have been adapted into the larger chronology. That said, there are story aspects from Minish Cap that have seemingly changed since it saw the light of day back in 2004. There was a time when all signs pointed to this adventure being the oldest story in the entire series, and in fact it was for a while anyway. It presented a compelling origin story for Link's iconic green cap, it featured a smaller Hyrule suggesting that the kingdom was still in its infancy, and it did not feature Ganondorf or his alter ego Ganon, which at the time was actually the first and only Zelda game to take place in Hyrule without Ganon being present in any capacity. But all of this changed with Skyward Sword, which to this day is considered the true beginning of the Zelda mythology after the creation of the universe by the Golden Goddesses. Link's green attire was given a new origin story, the land of Hyrule already exists, albeit not as a kingdom yet, we learned the backstory of the Master Sword, a 4th goddess who started Zelda's lineage, Demise and his demon curse which would eventually give rise to Ganon, so on and so forth. While the Minish Cap did retain its status as one of the oldest stories in the chronology, it's no longer the oldest, and with it certain lore aspects have since been re-evaluated, so to speak. And one of these aspects is the mystery of the Golden Light. Minish Cap's backstory tells of an ancient hero only known as the Hero of Men, a brave warrior who looks suspiciously similar to Link, albeit without the traditional green hat. According to legend, Hyrule was still in its early stages of development when a sudden surge of powerful demons laid siege to the young kingdom, threatening its total destruction. It was then that the Minish appeared from the sky, giving the hero a powerful sword known as the Pokori Blade and a golden light, which is mainly referred to as the Light Force. With newfound courage and wisdom in hand, the hero would successfully fend off the demonic horde and seal them inside of a chest, with the sword acting as its lock and key. There's no shortage of theories and speculation about the Hero of Men and the era he lived in, but I want to focus mainly on the Light Force. Over the course of the story, it's revealed that Vati, who himself was once a Minish, is in search of the Light Force so he can absorb it and become all-powerful. However, the whereabouts of this elusive golden light has remained a mystery, and near the end of the story it's revealed that it dwells inside none other than Princess Zelda herself, or more specifically, her bloodline. Right before the final boss fight, Vati successfully extracts a significant portion of the Light Force Triforce from Zelda, though not all of it, and transforms into the form we first saw in the original Four Swords and later in Four Swords Adventures. As opposed to Ganondorf, whose hatred and goals are for the most part geared towards the Kingdom of Hyrule and its royal family, Vati's ambitions seem to be less specific. The presence of the Light Force in Hyrule is what ultimately draws him into this realm, but he doesn't seem to hold a particular grudge against Hylians or the gods or anything like that. Instead, he simply wants to accumulate more and more power so he can spread chaos and destruction to the world at large. It's even stated that while in his demon form, he no longer remembers his former life as a Minish, which is in stark contrast to Ganondorf, who is still fully aware of who he is and was when he takes on his beast form. But there's something else that is closely tied to Ganondorf specifically when it comes to his general character and story arc: the Triforce. With the exception of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, every story after Skyward Sword that features the Triforce in some way will have some form of Ganondorf or Ganon present as well. He is as essential to the Triforce myth as Link and Zelda are in that sense. But like most other bad guys, Vati is not necessarily tied to the Triforce, and as such, Minish Cap's story does not center around the Holy Relic, nor is it even mentioned by name in any way. Similar to Breath of the Wild and, by extent, Tears of the Kingdom, there are depictions of the Triforce, but the actual object itself seems to have faded from memory. And in hindsight, this does make sense, because we learn from the Zelda timeline that the Triforce has been sealed and kept safe inside the Sacred Realm long before the events of Minish Cap, and its existence and whereabouts wouldn't be discovered until the events of Ocarina of Time, where Ganondorf invades the Sacred Realm and lays claim to the Triforce of Power. But let's step back for a moment and take a look at Minish Cap's lore from the perspective of someone from 2004. I don't think a lot of people realize just how incredibly different the Zelda lore community was back then. I mean, Skyward Sword and, perhaps more importantly, the first iteration of the official timeline issued by Nintendo were still 7 years away. People were still debating whether or not the timeline was linear or split at this point. And from this perspective, I think there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the Light Force was originally supposed to be a sort of origin story for the Triforce and how it found its way to Hyrule, or at the very least, the Triforce of Wisdom. So let's pretend we're back in 2004 and take a look at Minish Cap's narrative and backstory again through that lens. The stained glass window that reveals the true whereabouts of the Light Force depicts what we can assume is an earlier incarnation of Princess Zelda brandishing a yellow triangle and a text that reads, "The Force illuminates the country with the princess." Next is the synonym being used to refer to the Light Force, the Golden Light. Now, the Triforce has several synonyms of its own, some of which include the Golden Power, Golden Relic, the Golden Triangles, or the Power of Gold. It was created by the Golden Goddesses. The sacred realm it resides in on several occasions is also known as the Golden Land. It's referred to as the True Force or the Master Force. The temple that once housed it is known as the Temple of Light. I could go on and on. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the words golden, light, and force are commonly associated with the Triforce, and so it's not surprising that people drew a connection when they saw the words golden light for the first time. Next is the excerpt shown during the Hero of Men backstory. After obtaining the sword and golden light from the Minish, it is stated that with wisdom and courage, the hero drove out the darkness. Now, of course, this could mean nothing, even at the time, but I mean, come on, a golden triangle? Golden light? Wisdom and courage? How could you not think Triforce? During my research into this topic, I came across an old theory from someone known as River Zora, who proposes that perhaps during the era of Minish Cap, the three pieces of the Triforce, power, wisdom, and courage, may have existed as separate entities or objects. To quote them directly, either objects possessed by or imbued with the power of the Triforce, or indeed that they are physical reshapings of the Triforce itself. They referred to the same excerpt I mentioned before about how the Hero of Men used wisdom and courage to drive out the darkness, and adds to it even further by pointing to a text in the game's manual, which I personally never knew about. It's similar to the in-game text, however, the wording is a bit more nuanced and makes it clear that the wisdom and courage mentioned are specifically referring to the golden light and the sword respectively. So basically, the idea is that the Triforce of Wisdom would have taken on the form of the Golden Light, while Courage has been fused into the Picori Blade, which later becomes the Four Sword. As for the Triforce of Power, River Zora suggests that it's been imbued into the Trident from Four Swords Adventures, and I get where they're coming from. As much as I hate the idea, the Ganondorf from Four Swords Adventures is supposed to be a new incarnation of him, and in Ocarina of Time it's established that Ganondorf's demonic transformation into Ganon was made possible due to the Triforce of Power. Canonically, it's the first time he took on his beast form, and this moment was meant to serve as an origin story for the Ganon we first saw in the original Zelda and later in Zelda 2 and Link to the Past. So how did Ganondorf, the one from Four Swords Adventures, transform without being in possession of the Triforce of Power? This shouldn't be possible unless the Trident has indeed been fused with it. That being said, we know that this scenario is rather unlikely, at least according to the official timeline. However, once again, we have to look at River Zora's theory through the lens of the time it was made in, which in this case is 2009, still well over 2 years before Hyrule Historia and thus Nintendo's official Zelda timeline. For all we knew back in 2009, Four Swords Adventures took place sometime after Minish Cap and the original Four Swords, but still before Ocarina of Time. I mean, even today, people still feel like its placement at the end of the Child timeline was a mistake, and it would have made more sense if the game was placed earlier in the timeline, either somewhere in the unified timeline or, as some have suggested, in a separate timeline that branches off from either Skyward Sword or Minish Cap, depending on who you ask. If I was making Zelda theories in 2009, I would have probably suggested the Mage's Cap as the most likely candidate for the Triforce of Power. It's a cap that can not only grant wishes to whoever wears it, but it transforms Vati from a Minish into a powerful demon, the same way the Triforce of Power transformed Ganondorf into a demon. It's an extraordinarily powerful object when you really think about it, and I can't help but draw a connection between the wish-granting abilities of the Triforce and that of the Mage's Cap. In the final cutscene, Zelda even uses it to revert all the damage done to Hyrule by Vati, which is quite similar to the way Link undoes all of Ganon's actions at the end of A Link to the Past using the Triforce. But what exactly did the developers themselves have to say about it? Well, there is a 2005 interview with Minish Cap director Hidemaru Fujibayashi and producer Eiji Aonuma, in which the subject of the Golden Light is briefly touched upon. The interviewer asks, "In the prologue to the game, there are some hints that the Minish brought a golden light into Hyrule. Does this relate to the Triforce legend?" To which Fujibayashi says, "The golden light is a very, very old legend of Hyrule, and nobody knows how it relates to the Triforce legend. It is still a big mystery whether it has some relationship with the Triforce." So once again, in true Zelda fashion, instead of just giving it to us straight, the answer is left ambiguous and up for interpretation. But it does make you wonder, if the golden light was never meant to have anything to do with the Triforce, you would expect that Fujibayashi would simply deny a connection altogether and say they are two different things. The fact that he's unsure does raise a lot of suspicion and is probably the reason why there's been so many different theories about the golden light over the years. That said, according to the Zelda wiki, Eiji Aonuma, who supervised the development of Minish Cap, has allegedly stated in a different interview that the Triforce and Light Force are not the same. Unfortunately, I was not able to dig up this interview during my research, and the wiki doesn't provide a source for this supposed interview. I do vaguely remember seeing it somewhere a long time ago, so it probably does exist, but I haven't been able to find it since, so if any of you watching know more about it, then be sure to let me know down in the comments. Regardless, I am inclined to take the wiki at their word on this one since, well, it has since been established that the Light Force, despite some of its similarities to the Triforce, cannot be the same thing. And while I don't see the official timeline as sacred, this part of the timeline does make sense to me, mainly because it flows perfectly into Ocarina of Time's story. So the question is not, is the Golden Light the Triforce? Because according to the knowledge we have today, it can't be. Instead, we have to wonder if Fujibayashi and his team at Capcom did originally envision the Golden Light as an origin story for the Triforce back when they were developing Minish Cap, but that this idea has since been overwritten by other games. I think it's at the very least possible, especially because other story aspects from Minish Cap suffered a similar fate, like the aforementioned origin story for Link's green cap, which was basically retconned by Skyward Sword. However, I do have a suspicion of my own in regards to what Capcom was going for with the Golden Light. To me, it seems that they tried to create not necessarily an origin story for the Triforce or even the Triforce of Wisdom, but more so an origin story for Zelda's essence. At the time of Minish Cap's development, Princess Zelda's extraordinary magic power was still a bit of an underdeveloped idea. Sometimes it was attributed to the Triforce of Wisdom, but even when she's not in possession of it, she would still be capable of many unexplained things, like telepathy and seeing into the future, just to name a few. The Golden Light could have been a first attempt to explain these abilities and why pretty much every princess in the royal bloodline possesses similar powers. Of course, once again, this idea would eventually be superseded by Skyward Sword, which explains that the essence of Goddess Hylia is the main reason why future incarnations of Zelda are so powerful. But again, this hadn't been established yet back in 2004, and the same goes for a lot of other concepts like the soul of the hero and the eternal curse of demise. Another possibility, and one that's perhaps the most realistic, is that Capcom simply didn't put much thought behind the Golden Light and how it would connect to the larger mythology. And thus, when Fujibayashi was asked if there is a connection during the interview, he left it up to the players to decide, at least for the time being. I can imagine that as an employee at Capcom and not an official member of the Zelda team at Nintendo, he didn't want to shake the foundation of the Zelda mythology too much by making bold claims that could potentially clash with Nintendo's vision for the series' lore. The Triforce is a very delicate and vital part of the mythology, and trying to mess with it, especially as the outsider he was at the time, would have been a bit of a risk. So with all that said, let's jump back to the present day. What is the Golden Light supposed to be if not the Triforce? I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, but for those who aren't up to speed, the most accepted theory is that the yellow triangle seen on the stained glass window is supposed to be a Force Gem. Now, Force Gems are an entire story in and of itself, and the lore behind them has evolved quite a bit over the years. They were first introduced in Four Swords Adventures as a triangle-shaped collectible, which, according to the devs, was inspired by the similar-looking pieces of power from Link's Awakening. Basically, the idea here is in order to complete a stage, a magic force field needs to be dispelled using the Four Sword. However, the sword has lost most of its power, and so the only way to charge it back up again, enough to break the barrier, is to collect Force Gems by defeating enemies and searching for treasure, forcing the player to engage with the level instead of just running past everything. When viewed on its own, it sort of implies that the Force Gems are specifically tied to the Four Sword mythos, and are basically crystallized pieces of the sword's essence. And when looking at it that way, one could assume that the Golden Light from Minish Cap is simply the original and complete power source of the sword, represented by a single golden Force Gem. That said, the lore behind Force Gems isn't as straightforward anymore, because Four Swords Adventures is no longer the only game to feature them. They appear in both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks as well, and here they have nothing to do with the Four Sword. In Phantom Hourglass, gold-colored Force Gems can be found inside the Temple of the Ocean King, and are used to open up the way forward by completing a Triforce symbol. Furthermore, according to Oshus, the Sand of Hours that powers the Phantom Hourglass is made from Force Gems as well. In Spirit Tracks, they are multicolored, upside-down triangles Link collects at the end of each dungeon, and will transmit energy to the Tower of Spirits, slowly restoring it. In addition, there are smaller, golden Force Gems Link can obtain by helping the people of New Hyrule, very similar to the Gratitude Crystals from Skyward Sword. So, in short, Force Gems have become a sort of universal concept for the power or energy that makes up the very fabric of the universe, in particular inside living organisms and certain magical artifacts. In fact, in Japanese, Light Force, Life Force, and Force Gems are all treated as one and the same, and are simply called Force. This so-called force or life energy can take on all kinds of different shapes, from particles to liquids to crystals, and it's more than likely that the Ancient Energy and Zonai Energy from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are also based on the same concept. All in all, what started as a simple collectible in a multiplayer Zelda game has since taken on a life of its own, and it's now a fundamental part of the Zelda mythology. Last but not least, even though we know that the Golden Light cannot be the Triforce or even a piece of the Triforce, on a technical level they do actually share a connection. While not the same as the Golden Light, the Triforce does consist of the same energy that makes up all other things in the universe, just in a much higher concentration. If the concept of force in the Zelda universe is something that interests you, I've made two videos that cover a lot of the aspects behind it. One that centers around the Master Sword, and another about the whereabouts of the Triforce in the era of Breath of the Wild. While these videos were meant to serve as a sort of story prediction for Tears of the Kingdom, which is obviously outdated now, they do cover a bunch of lore from other Zelda games as well. So if you're interested, I recommend giving them a watch if you haven't already. And that is all for now. A huge thanks as always to my Patreon supporters and channel members who continue to make this channel possible, to all of you for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.